My name is Michael Stevens. I'm a professor at Illinois State University and also at the Lucian Blaga University in Sibiu, Romania. I'm an international psychologist by specialty, and within that area I've done some research on terrorism, which I'll be talking about right now.
Is there a profile of a terrorist?
Well, there isn't a single profile per se. One of the major areas of research that has been conducted by many different experts has addressed the topic of whether terrorists are more pathological, let us say, than a typical or average person. And contrary to sort of our intuitions, there really are no major differences in terms of diagnosable psychopathology between terrorists and normals. And in fact, very interestingly, some research has shown that at the leadership level in business and industry versus the leadership level of terrorist organizations, there's more psychopathology among leaders in business and industry, oddly enough. But beyond that issue of pathology versus normalcy, there are some distinguishing characteristics of terrorists. One of which is that by temperament they may certainly have a higher threshold for violence. They have a tendency to show an easier capacity to disengage morally from horrendous acts. They also show a cognitive style that perhaps we could say is characterized by dichotomous thinking, lack of tolerance for ambiguity, black and white thinking. Another characteristic I would say of terrorists tends to be that they have a personal stake in the particular cause that they are involved with. For example, they may have felt that a family member was killed or injured unjustly by perhaps an oppressive occupier or something along those lines. And so not only do they have a personal stake, but they oftentimes have an ideological intensity about the particular issue that led to this personal tragedy. So these are some areas that I think do distinguish terrorists from, if you will, sort of the average person. But again, we're not speaking about psychopathology. We are speaking about higher incidences of these characteristics than we might find on average.
That is very interesting. Now, so is that what motivates terrorist ideological ideas, or the idea of just make a more just adjustment of their society? What motivates them?
Well, in terms of motivation, certainly that is one very important motivator, this sense of utilizing whatever means are available in an unequal war for freedom, for liberation, for justice, for a cause, and certainly that does motivate some terrorists. But again, contrary to logic, a very large proportion of terrorists are not wedded to a particular ideology. In fact, the motivation for terrorists tends to be social. And let me backtrack a little bit before I talk about that more extensively. There's been some research in which terrorists who've been captured were actually asked about the ideology of the group to which they belong. Members of the IRA, members of Al-Qaeda, they were asked very simple questions. What is the mission of this organization, or what are the main objections that Osama bin Laden has against the United States? And a very large proportion of the foot soldiers of these terrorist organizations do not answer correctly or simply do not know. So ideology can't possibly be motivating them because they don't have an understanding of the ideology of the group that they belong to. So what does motivate them? The other type of research that has been done has shown that in large part the motivational force tends to be social. And when you think about terrorists, and you think a little bit about sort of the demographics of terrorists, they tend to be young, single, males who are not connected very well to family, perhaps because of any number of reasons. And one of the things that brings these young men together with some sense of meaning and purpose is belonging to a group.
Belonging to a group.
Belonging to a group, and it, in a sense, doesn't matter that much what the ideology of the group is, as long as it helps these young men establish a sense of meaning, a sense of identity, a sense of connectedness, a sense of life purpose. And in some ways, you could argue that the recruitment of terrorists has a parallel in the recruitment of gang members in any inner city. Now, what are some of the characteristics that are common? Again, rootlessness, poverty, lack of opportunity. So there are some larger social forces that instill this need for social connectedness. And I'm certainly not suggesting that the way around this is to get these young men to join a book club. But in all seriousness, obviously there are some underlying structural problems in any society or any community in which there are gang problems and in which terrorists are recruited from young men that need to be addressed. So again, a large proportion of these young men tend to be motivated by this very, very powerful desire to belong, and in a meaningful way, to their peers.
Now, is there a difference that you have observed between terrorists, let's say, from Europe versus Latin America versus the Middle East?
In my own reading of the research, I really can't say for sure whether there are these strong differences. There may be some experts who have more direct contact with these individuals and who have done research. Clearly, the level of violence is disproportionately high in not only the Middle East, but in South Asia. And speaking about South Asia, of course, I'm talking about the Tamil Tigers, who recently were defeated after many decades by the Sri Lankan government. In Latin America, the level of terrorism has maintained itself at sort of a low but constant level. The number of incidents, the number of deaths has remained constant over perhaps the past 5 years or so. Some of the methods have been a little bit more devastating, a slight increase in casualties, but overall there's really not much of a comparison in terms of level of violence. Now again, culturally speaking, if someone is indoctrinated into a Islamic extremist group, there are cultural and religious incentives to engage in acts that potentially could result in loss of life, including one's own. Again, the cultural and religious traditions in Latin America, I would assume, would preclude that, or at least make that much less likely. Now, in terms of other conditions that give rise to the motivation to become a terrorist, they may very well be similar. Oppression, poverty, lack of opportunity, social injustice, these may be somewhat universal factors that express themselves in different ways, but still have some causal commonality.
Now, how effective are these terrorist groups to achieve whatever goals they set themselves out to achieve?
The effectiveness of terrorist groups is much less than we might believe at first glance. Now, there are historical cases in which terrorists, or terrorism I should say, has really resulted in colonial powers leaving and returning territory and land to the indigenous people. Kenya is one example, Algeria is another. So there are occasions in which terrorism will work, so to speak, meaning that the target will make concessions based upon these acts of terror. However, there was a very extensive study done of 28 terrorist groups, and these groups had collectively approximately 40, a little bit more than 40 objectives. And the study basically tried to identify the degree to which there was total or partial success based upon the concessions, either a total concession or partial concession of the target to the demands of these terrorist groups. Only 7% of their goals were conceded, even partially. So 7% is a very, very low proportion of success, much less so than, again, we would think based upon what we read about in the media. Now, why would there be so little success? Well, one of the reasons why there's such little success is that regardless of what the goals of a terrorist organization are, their methods and the consequences of their methods communicate something potentially different. Now, let me give you an example of this. If a terrorist organization wants to establish an independent homeland for a group of people within a particular geographical area, a noble cause, certainly. But if their method involves bombing buses in which there are civilian casualties and deaths, the consequences of killing civilians communicate something very different than liberation. It communicates extremism, and it suggests to the general population, look, this terrorist organization really isn't interested in liberation and a homeland for their own people. They're interested in apocalyptic change, the total destruction of our values and our way of life. So to get back to the point of effectiveness, one of the reasons why terrorist organizations are not effective is that their strategies produce outcomes that cause the population and the government to suspect that what would be the point in making a concession of giving some land to these people when their methods suggest that it's really not the land that they want or a free homeland, but something even more extreme, the total destruction of the dominant culture or the dominant society. And so under those circumstances, the general population and governments often become very hard. And initially they may be somewhat sympathetic, but after several of these civilian target attacks, they become very conservative and respond very harshly. And then you sort of have this war of attrition that can continue endlessly, hypothetically speaking. So I would say that, again, I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, but I do think that one of the problems with terrorist organizations is that they use methods that in fact undermine their basic goal. If they really wanted things like a free homeland or access to for political voice in society, killing civilians is just the opposite thing that they should be doing. As desperate as they are, as oppressed as they are, this will produce a very, very powerful negative reaction.
Is there anything else that I should have asked you and I didn't?
Let me think for a moment. I don't really believe so. I think we've tried to cover some things that ordinarily are not sort of in the mainstream of general understandings of terrorism, and food for thought, for sure.